Okay, so awesome. I'm Ashley, if you don't already know. I'm a rising junior at Green Hill School, and I'm also an instructor for the Worlds Division for Project Dialogue this year.
Hi, I'm Anais. I am the lab leader, one of the lab leaders for Novice LD Lab. I just graduated from Green Hill School in Dallas this past year, and I will be attending Dartmouth College in the fall. And yeah, me and Ashley are really excited to be presenting this lecture to you all. We highly encourage you guys to take notes in order to better absorb the information. And as this is not a topic that is often covered in schools, we will definitely do our best to, teach you about what we have learned regarding the topic.
So, just as an introduction, we're going to be talking about the making of Asian America and the model minority myth. To be clear, I don't think that either one of these topics can really be discussed in full in just 1 hour. So we are going to go a little over, like a little more briefly, but it'll be a good introduction into both of the topics.
Mhm.
Next slide is good. So talking about how we want to discuss these issues and how we want to understand them, um, these are really complex topics. So we want to make sure that before we get into them, we're being clear about what we expect and what we want to talk about in today's elective. If Anais wants to go more about it.
Yeah. So here are some expectations and ground rules that we want to lay. First is that make sure that you should be respectful of different opinions, not just in this lecture, but really throughout camp. These are really, oh, I think someone is in the waiting room. Oh, yes, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ashley. We should be respectful of different opinions because everybody comes from a different background, from a different social location, and our views and opinions are shaped by our experiences. So even if there are some things that you don't agree with in these slides, or you have heard of other people that have talked about these issues using different words or coming at it from a different perspective, you should understand that, I mean, these are really complex topics. So we just want to provide our opinions, and we hope that you will, be open-minded. Ashley, do you have anything you want to add?
We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So before we get into everything, I'm going to see if anyone wants to talk about what they know about the model minority myth or if anyone knows what it is. I can't see anyone, so if you guys just want to start talking, that's fine.
Isn't the model minority myth that like Asians are supposedly less violent than other minorities with darker skin?
Yeah, that's definitely a component of the model minority myth. Does anyone else want to add on to Sunny?
Um, I would say that a lot of common misconceptions about the model minority myth is that Asian Americans, oh no, like Asian immigrants specifically, like work hard to get where they are, and like they're super smart, and because they work hard, that's why they're doing so well, and like that's why they have such good jobs compared to people of color who like supposedly don't work as hard, and that's the model minority myth.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with both Salim and Sunny. I think that those are definitely components of the model minority myth. However, the term model minority specifically refers to a minority that has achieved success within the parameters of a dominant culture. And even though the term model minority most often refers to Asian Americans, just like Salim outlined, it can be used to describe other minority groups as well. It's just that because it's used so predominantly to refer to Asian Americans, that it's often associated and often used to talk about Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in general. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so first of all, we're going to be talking about a brief history of Asian America, and we're going to be talking about a timeline that describes how Asian America was created. As you can see on the timeline, again, this is a really brief history of Asian America. Obviously, there are many more events that aren't related and aren't put on this timeline. It's just for the sake of time, we compiled like the key events during Asian American history. The 1850s to 1860s was the arrival of a large swath of Asian Americans within America, and most of them were Chinese immigrants who were going to the west of America, and they were working on the railroads and working for really cheap and in really bad labor conditions because there were no other opportunities for them in America. As a result of that, what happened was a lot of really, really racist and xenophobic hate at the hands of white individuals who perceived these Chinese immigrants and Asian Americans in general as stealing jobs because they were willing to work for really cheap and also in really bad labor conditions. So what that led to was in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. That was a result of all of that hate that came from just the presence of Asian Americans. And what the Chinese Exclusion Act outlined was basically in the future, Chinese immigrants would not be allowed to come to America, would not be allowed to immigrate, and existing Chinese immigrants would have to carry documentation and identification with them at all times. And if they disobeyed, they would be beaten up or arrested by law enforcement. Even though this only referred to Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants, a lot of these issues resulted in Asian American hate in general because of existing racism. So anyone who is perceived to look like a Chinese person was also included in that hate, was also forced to carry documentation and identification. Again, all of that hate kept building up, and that led to the 1924 National Origins Act, which was a broader act that prevented nearly every single Asian immigrant from legally entering the United States, and it prohibited immigrants that were already in the United States from attaining citizenship. So obviously, these are very, very discriminatory policies, and it's important to note that the Chinese Exclusion Act and the National Origins Act were both discriminatory immigration policies that set the groundwork for discrimination in immigration within the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first piece of discriminatory immigration policy in all of American history, and that shows how kind of big of an impact it had. Moving on to the 1940s, again, there's a lot of events that are happening between these, but just for the sake of time, we're going over the major ones. In the 1940s, at the height of World War II, there was intense anti-Japanese sentiment within the United States. A lot of individuals within the United States who were Japanese were told to get out of the country, were told that they were traitors because of Japan's involvement in World War II. And what that led to was not only intense anti-Japanese sentiment, but also Japanese internment camps. I'm not sure if you guys know this. This is like the only point of all of Asian American history that I learned about in school. But these were camps where Japanese Americans and even sometimes Chinese and Korean Americans, because of what they look like, were forced into internment camps, and their belongings and possessions were stolen from them, and they were forced to go to camps around the nation and live there for a period of like 6 to 8 years. And this was obviously something really bad. It doesn't get that much focus. It doesn't get too much focus on in history classrooms and history textbooks, even though this was a large portion of Asian American and American history as well. But these were really, really bad conditions. And a lot of these individuals who went into these camps report saying that they like literally had little to no food. Some people starved in these camps. The camps just had really bad conditions and weren't really accommodating for anyone within them. Moving on to the 1960s, where we saw the Asian American movement, and this was a turning point within Asian American history. What we saw was that the Asian American movement largely seemed to achieve a lot of benefits for Asian Americans. It seemed like Asian Americans were finally getting some sort of political voice. It seemed like the oppression that Asian Americans had faced within the last century was finally coming to a close. And we'll be going over the Asian American movement a little deeper in different electives, but just know that it was similar to the civil rights movement in that Asian Americans all around the nation were kind of coming together and were fighting for both political and social rights. And it seemed like that fight had been successful. But then in 1982, the murder of Vincent Chin, who was an innocent Chinese man in Detroit, Michigan, happened. So Vincent Chin was at his bachelor's party, literally having his wedding the next week. And he was basically beaten very brutally by two white men and killed by those two white men. And his brain and his skull were like broken into. It was just very, very violent, and a very, very horrific death. However, when those two men went on trial, the two white men, they were acquitted of any charge, even though there were a number of eyewitnesses that saw them beating Vincent Chin to death. What acquitting means is that they got to walk. They weren't charged with anything. They were found not guilty of the crime, even though, again, there were a number of white eyewitnesses. And there were also, the autopsy showed that he was dead as a result of the beating. So it seemed like, even though everything that had been achieved from the Asian American movement, we were kind of regressing back into a time of the Yellow Peril and back into a very oppressive time for Asian Americans. As you can see on the left, there's a little box that says the Yellow Peril. This is another term that's very important within Asian American history. It refers to Western fears that Asians would invade white lands and disrupt Western values. And even though this reached its peak within the 1940s of Japanese internment camps, it's also happening right now with COVID-19 and a lot of the Asian hate that is coming as a result of the coronavirus, and the terms that are used to refer to Asians in the modern world and modern day. So even though the Yellow Peril is a historic term that refers to the Asian hate that happened within the 19th and 20th century, it's, again, still present within the status quo.
Just out of curiosity, can I see a show of hands for people who have learned about two or more of these historical events in school before?
Yeah, so as you see, there's not that many people that know about these issues. I think it's just Mira. So it's kind of obvious that even though these are like huge issues within Asian American history, they're not talked about at all within history textbooks. They're not talked about in history classes. And it's kind of another, I'll be getting into this a little later, but it's another way that the model minority myth has suppressed Asian voices and has really excluded Asians from the narrative of white supremacy and just American society in general. We can go to the next slide.
Really quickly, does someone want to volunteer to share what they have learned about any one of these events in school? Because we really want to make this presentation interactive, and we want to hear y'all's voices as well.
I didn't learn about this in school, but I kind of think that the reason why like the Asian community is kind of like not heard is because we don't really have that much representation like social media wise, because like the other minorities, they have like Beyonce and they have like all these people who are representing them, but we don't like, there's no one for like the Asians.
Yeah, no, that's because we're ignored, because from other people's perspective, we're like, you know, they think we have the white privilege, or like, and then they don't really focus on us because we're not really a problem, or we're not being like, you know, treated bad, when it's like,
yeah, both.
Like how many Asians do you see? Like if an Asian got arrested and had like you know, got killed or something like that, I doubt it would even make news. Like the chances of it spreading like and having protests everywhere is really, really rare. Like,
yeah, so I want to add on to what Bowen said, which I think is really interesting. So after Ashley just went over this entire timeline, you've learned a little bit about Asian history. There's still a question of why Asians are scarcely represented in media. And one thing that you touched on is white privilege. Does anyone know what white privilege is, or can anyone define that term for me?
white privilege is basically where it's like you go in a car, right, and you're going 100 miles per hour, and the police officer just goes like, oh, it's fine. Like next time just make sure to slow down.
Okay, so that's an example, but the underlying theory behind that is that you are at an elevated status, or you're somehow shielded by the color of your skin because you're white. In some cases, this applies to Asian Americans because of how Asians have been criticized for proximity to whiteness. Like Asians are stereotypically cast as hardworking, like someone talked about in our introduction, because of the way that we're trying to move up the social rank. And that's something that has really been criticized a lot. And some people would argue that it's a good thing because of how it affords Asian Americans benefits. Other people would argue that it further props up the model minority because it's being used as a tool of white supremacy. So one last thing to note before we move on is that the yellow peril here and the model minority are deeply intertwined because Asians oscillate between being cast as hardworking, obedient subjects, the model minority, climbing up the social ladder. And at another moment, when epidemics like SARS break out or when the coronavirus breaks out, we're very easily demonized and cast as the yellow peril.
Can I pitch in one quick point there? I think that's actually really important to know. But I think for especially the duality between the yellow peril and the model minority myth is actually originated from 1965's Hart-Celler Act, which is also known as Immigration Nationality Act. So the only thing that I think may be even more important to this timeline that you see here is that following the Hart-Celler Act, which is what allowed for high-skilled workers and Asian Americans to come into the United States, there was a construction of the model minority myth, which I think, I'm sorry if I interrupted, and Anais is probably going to talk about this more, but between that period, right, we can kind of see a very prominent divide with more yellow peril sentiments and the demonization of Asian Americans prior to the 1960s versus like a sort of hardworking stereotypes for the model minority and Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. Imagine that is an important note.
All right, so I will be talking about the intersection with broader American society. So first, let's talk about the Cold War really quickly. Does anyone know what the Cold War is? Somebody give me like a one-sentence explanation of what it was.
An arms race between Russia and America.
Yeah, exactly. So Russia and America were in a fight to acquire nuclear weapons in order to assert their dominance on the world. And the Cold War is a time period that occurred, I believe, 1960s, following World War II, where the competing ideals of communism and capitalism were fighting on the world stage. At this time, Asian Americans were weaponized by the American state to combat communism. There was a brain drain. This period of time is sort of characterized as a brain drain of a lot of Asians from Asia. Based on the act that Brian talked about, a lot of like intellectuals, scholarly Asian subjects were recruited to come to the United States in order to be productive, hardworking citizens. And Asians were basically used as a tool of white supremacy in a lot of propaganda objects. So the US could basically say, hey, look at us and all these obedient, hardworking, reproducing Asian American subjects. Compare that to these failed communist states and how they're really struggling to support their own citizens and how they're really struggling to do well. And so that led to the production of good Asian subjects such as Wen Ho Lee. And Wen Ho Lee was actually one of the most famous Asian Americans who basically was recruited as like a scientist in a lab, but he was touted as the model minority. And then right here, we have the yellow peril versus the model minority. We already talked a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. There are a lot of massacres and lynchings of Asian Americans because of a lot of racism and hate crimes that were occurring towards them, and also just a lot of anti-Asian sentiment building up. Once again, Asians oscillate between the yellow peril and the model minority. Like we talked about previously, at one point they can be demonized, and at one point they can be elevated to be perfect Asian American subjects. How coronavirus has changed the perception of Asianness. I sort of already talked about, I mean, you guys have probably seen this in the media a lot, right? Raise your hand if you have seen or heard about Asian Americans being targeted because of the coronavirus. Yeah, that's practically everyone, right? What are some reasons that you guys think that Asian Americans have been associated with the coronavirus and why they're experiencing hate crimes?
Because the virus came from China, and because of China's kind of unwillingness to shut it down like immediately, the rest of the world kind of blames China, and because Asians are associated with their descent in Asia instead of being American, we're blamed for the coronavirus.
Yeah, exactly.
It goes a little further as well, Jeanette. I completely agree with you. However, I will say that I don't think that the issues going on within the United States of like attacks against Asian Americans or attacks against Asians in general is really that prominent in other countries. I definitely think that the reason why Asian Americans uniquely are targeted during this time is because of the perception of whiteness and Asianness within the United States. And we're going to be going on to this in the later slides, but just as a quick note, the large reason why there is oppression within the United States against Asians right now is because we are never going to be considered white enough for white society, but we're never going to be considered minority enough for other people of color and other minority groups. So we're never going to be able to fully assimilate, and that's the reason why we're able to be like turned on so quickly, as we have seen during COVID-19. We can move to the next slide if that works. And yeah, we're going to be talking about manifestations of the myth and kind of like where the origin of the myth is. If you go to the next slide, Anais. So let's talk about the first time that the myth was created and talk about what the origin of the myth really is. If you move to the next slide, we're going to be talking about two specific points during 1960 that led to the creation of the term model minority. So first of all, kind of like what Brian was mentioning earlier, 1965 immigration acts were active recruiting of professional classes of immigrants in both STEM and medical fields. So this was like the active recruiting on behalf of the United States government to get STEM and medical immigrants within the country. And what that resulted in was a lot of recruitment from Asia and having like highly educated immigrants from Asian continent to come over to the United States. At the same time that this was going on, there was also the civil rights movement, where Black Americans were leading protest movements for social justice and political equality. So after all and during all of these like movements and during these acts, what was going on was that white Americans and the government as a whole was looking towards both of these things and saw the fact that, oh, we have this huge influx of this new minority coming in that is adding on to Asian Americans. We can use it as a way to silence these people who are protesting for their own rights and for social justice. So what happened because of these two things going on at the same time, these new immigrants coming in who were highly educated and were able to kind of make a name for themselves almost immediately because of their high education and that recruitment from the United States, their presence was used to kind of cover up any of the dissent that was going on during the civil rights movement. You can move on to the next slide. So the first time the term model minority was used was in a 1966 New York Times article. Again, note that that comes after the Immigration Acts of 1965. So this 1966 New York Times article was written by a white sociologist, and it was named Success Story Japanese American Style. Also, just quick note, I literally did not know about this until like 4 months ago, which is like kind of surprising because I feel like I'm a pretty big advocate for Asian American advocacy and rights in general. So it's really surprising that it's not more well known. But this article, again named Success Story Japanese American Style, was literally an article comparing Black Americans and Japanese Americans and the difference between success. So what they said was that Japanese Americans were an obedient minority that was a model minority that has made full use of the American dream, and they were able to come back from the internment, from the history of oppression, and they were able to build themselves up. So why couldn't Black Americans do the same? This whole article was literally a racist article used to silence Black Americans and use it as a way to like propel Asian Americans as like this model, as this hardworking, intelligent, and obedient minority. So the first usage of the term model minority was literally used to create a hierarchy between minorities within America, and it was used to put Black Americans down, while Asian Americans were also being silenced because of their history. Because as you remember, as you probably remember from the timeline, literally 10 years before this New York Times article, Japanese Americans were subject to mass incarceration, and they were subject to theft of their own property, and they witnessed dispersal of their own communities. I think that it's kind of problematic for this New York Times article to literally come out 10 years later after all of that had happened and say that Japanese Americans were suddenly successful in the United States, erasing the history of oppression that they had gone through. You can go to the next slide. So what the model minority myth has created is that really vicious hierarchy of racism in which Asian Americans are perceived to be at the top, and they're silenced for saying anything that goes against what white Americans want them to. And then other minorities are below them, and always being compared to Asian Americans. And there's a couple of reasons why this is really bad. Obviously, like the first one is that like there shouldn't be a hierarchy. But one of the more nuanced reasons is because it ignores the diversity of Asian American cultures. Does anyone know what we're saying when we say that it ignores the diversity of Asian American cultures?
They think everyone who's Asian is Chinese.
Okay, so yeah, basically kind of like that, but at the same time, it's a little more nuanced just because they view Asian Americans as this one collective. And not only do they view it as just one group, they also group together the experiences of every single ethnicity and every single identity within that culture. So as a Chinese American, I have a vastly different experience than someone who is Korean American or someone who is Japanese American, and even further, someone who is Southeast America, someone from Southeast Asia, or someone from South Asia itself. I'm going to have a very, very different experience than those groups, yet because of the model minority myth, that grouping of Asian Americans only makes it so that it's kind of like, oh, all Asians are successful regardless of the experience that they've gone through or regardless of the barriers that they've had to face throughout American society. Even further, the model minority myth erases racism against Asian Americans. I think Anais can take this one.
Yeah. So in a world where Asian Americans are cast as, you know, hardworking and deserving of what they have because they work so hard, it is very easy to trivialize the very real struggles that Asian Americans do face and erases racism against Asian Americans. So even though we definitely do not experience the amount of violence and hatred that a lot of our minority friends do, such as African Americans and also Latinos do, at the same time, we are definitely not elevated and experience the privilege of being white very easily, getting job referrals, like having our transgressions being overlooked. So we're still discriminated against in very real ways. And by just saying and issuing a blanket statement that all Asian Americans, you know, are good at math and that we don't experience oppression because we're hardworking is pretty harmful. It's a pernicious stereotype.
Definitely. And then going on to the next reason, it also operates alongside the myth of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. And what we mean by this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, right? So Asian Americans are always seen as perpetual foreigners. We're not really seen as white enough or American enough to fit into white and American society. But at the very same time, what the model minority myth does is make it so we can't fit in with other minority groups. It makes it so that we can't really feel welcome to identify as maybe like a person of color or identify as someone who has faced oppression, because it's quite clear we have not faced the same oppression as other minority groups, and I don't think that that oppression should ever be compared. However, the reason why the model minority myth is so bad in this case is because it not only ignores the suffering that Asian Americans have faced, it also makes it so that we don't feel comfortable to talk about it, and it makes it so we don't feel comfortable to actually speak out, because it not only silences our voices by making it seem like we're these obedient minorities, it also makes it so that we're not white enough, but we're also not foreign enough to kind of like go along with these other minorities and be part of those liberation efforts as well. So it's this perpetual struggle between never seeming white enough, but not seeming minority enough within America. And it always makes it seem like we're foreigners that can't fit in anywhere within the United States. And the fourth reason is because the model minority myth is really harmful to not only the struggle of Asian Americans, but also the struggle for racial justice as a whole. So I'm pretty sure we've kind of touched on this a little bit before, but when paired with racist myths about other ethnic and racial groups, the model minority myth is used as evidence to downplay or deny the racism that is very, very evident within American society. It's creating that hierarchy where Asian people are represented at the top, and white people often use the excuse that Asian people could do it, so why can't you? Given the history of that really racist term, the myth is ultimately a means to perpetuate anti-Blackness within America and is used to distract us from striving together towards liberation for all. Because like I mentioned before, it creates that racial wedge between other minority groups and white individuals, so we never feel like we're going to be able to identify with one or the other, but at the same time, we feel like we can't speak out about issues on racial justice. And then at the very same time, we feel like we can't speak out, but other minority groups are silenced because we're used as Asian Americans as a tool to oppress those groups and as a tool for white supremacy to kind of silence anyone who is speaking out against the really racist history and racist systems that are present within America. Again, note here that it's not that Asian Americans suddenly it's not that Asian Americans have like this ingrained nature of hard work, or that like we have tiger moms that make us study hard and like work hard. I think that there's definitely a little bit of truth within like, oh, we're expected to study hard, but that's not something that's inherently with Asian Americans. I think that's something present within immigrant families in general, not just Asian Americans. The reason why Asian Americans suddenly were able to jump to such a high level of education and success within the United States was first because these immigrants coming in were highly educated already, and second, Asian Americans were suddenly treated with more respect than before, because white Americans wanted to tout us as this success story that could oppress other minority groups. It's not because Asian Americans are inherently smarter. It's not because Asian Americans are inherently better at certain subjects like science and math. I definitely think that those are really false statements and stereotypes that come out of the model minority myth. The reason why we are faced with so much success now, and again, that's a large generalization of the Asian American community, the reason why on average Asian Americans have higher social standing and higher economic success is because we were finally accepted in some way to put down other minority groups, and as a result, we benefited from that.
So just to package it really quickly, the model minority is a status conferred by the majority for the majority's own purposes. The majority in this case is the like white Anglo-Saxon people that lived in the United States and wanted to weaponize Asian American success. In order to denigrate African Americans and to minimize the potential impact of the civil rights movement. Oh, no.
And just quickly to answer Bowen, yeah, that's the reason why we see those stereotypes, and that's the reason why we see like jokes like there's always an Asian better than you. And while you might not think that those are like super harmful, at the same time, those are jokes that are perpetuating like the stereotypes that Asian Americans face, and also perpetuating anti-Blackness because it puts down other groups while simultaneously trying to push up Asians. And Anais can maybe take the lead on this slide, talking about stereotypes.
Yeah, sure. So here are some common stereotypes of the model minority. Many of these you probably already know. Hardworking and academically successful. So, I mean, the way that a lot of people, okay, I don't want to generalize, but based on my experience, from my perspective, my parents have always wanted me to be academically successful. They've really prioritized doing well in school. They've always wanted me to, finish my homework, to be on top of things. And based off of my interactions with people from similar backgrounds, I would argue that Asian parents definitely have a very high expectation of what they want their kids to do and how well they should be doing at school. Asian Americans are also sort of cast as silent and obedient because this, I feel like, sort of pairs with the fact that we don't have a lot of representation on social media and in entertainment. Because we are noticeably absent from these avenues, it's very easy for issues that Asian Americans experience, these sort of issues, to not be talked about very often and not be at the forefront of our discussions. T20 college graduate, I mean, the topic on every Asian mom's lips is, where's my kid going to go to college? How's my kid going to go to this college? What major are they going to be? How is my kid going to be successful? And a lot of that discussion revolves around, pursuing higher education. Also, another stereotype is that Asian Americans will pursue conventional job opportunities. We can't break from the norm. I know this is sort of said jokingly. There are 3 options for an Asian American: a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. But I mean, that is a stereotype that you definitely see being circulated around a lot. I will argue that, especially this one, the hardworking, academically successful one, this is probably the model minority myth that hurts and it affects you guys the most because all of you guys are students. This studious Asian stereotype is particularly harmful because when academic success is tied to identity, it can lead to anxiety, and a lot of mental health experts have talked about how this can lead to things like depression, anxiety, and a decreased sense of self-worth when you tie yourself to your identity to being hardworking and academically successful. So I think it's important for Asian Americans to understand that, yes, it is valuable for us to look towards achieving good grades and to being academically successful. However, tying that to one's identity can really lead to feelings of self-worth going down, and also spikes in depression when you feel that, a part of you're not living up to the standards of your identity.
Just really quickly, we're going to pause. Does anyone have any other stereotypes that they've faced that they think has come as a result of the model minority myth that they would like to share? Okay, if no one wants to share, I can kind of talk about this myself. I think that the idea of Asian Americans being silent and obedient especially hurts Asian women. We're kind of like stereotyped to be submissive and silent and obedient at all times, and it kind of draws away from our voice. And that's the reason why you don't see as many Asian American women, I feel, in I guess like more dominant jobs, because the model minority myth is kind of a self-proclaiming prophecy, right? If we continue saying things like, oh, Asians are hardworking, academically successful, Asians are silent and obedient, Asians are held to higher SAT scores, like Jeanette says, those are all things that hurt Asian Americans because we feel the need to achieve those goals, and it kind of just becomes a cycle in which we have those stereotypes forced onto us, and after we have those stereotypes forced onto us, we feel the need to live up to them, and then we continue that cycle without actually being able to break from it or break from the stereotypes that are pushed onto us by the white society. We can move on to the next slide.
All right. Why is the myth pernicious? So the first reason, or the first topic that I will be talking about is appropriation of success. So one, we already touched on this a little bit based on how sort of these immigration laws came into effect at the same time as the civil rights movement, and about how the white majority used our success to tear down other groups and people of color. So basically you can think of the model minority basically as a pawn of the white majority. So it's very simply used to tear down other minority groups. And secondly, it excludes Asians from people of color. Something to note is that in college admissions, when you refer to an index of what the definition of a minority is, Asians are just blatantly excluded from that. So what that means is that certain other groups, such as African Americans, Latinos, I think Hawaiians, other Asian ethnic groups such as like Malaysians, Filipinos, etc., are all included. However, certain Asians are excluded. So once again, this is just an example of the white majority trying to draw lines and to divvy up what exactly counts as a person of color and what doesn't. This is really harmful once again, because it means that our feelings are validated, and when racism actually occurs to us, it is ignored. Hot topics for discussion. Affirmative action. Does anyone? Yeah, Ashley.
Yeah, so we chose two topics that we thought would have like a lot of disagreement on them. I'm sure some people agree with affirmative action and some people disagree, coming from a standpoint of like an Asian American. If anyone wants to voice their opinion, we'd love that. And we'd like to talk about how the model minority myth has led to affirmative action and the discussion around affirmative action to kind of be louder. If anyone wants to add or chime in. Does everyone know what affirmative action is? Like, let's start there. No. Okay.
Still shaking heads. Okay.
Anais, you want to explain that? Or?
Yeah. So, affirmative action is basically a system prominently used by colleges in order to sort of elevate or give preference to people from certain ethnic backgrounds. So basically the way that it's commonly represented in media is that proponents of affirmative action say that it is beneficial because underrepresented minority groups are given access to a traditional college experience, and they're sort of given access to opportunities that they wouldn't have come by themselves. So those are what proponents of affirmative action would describe it as. People that are against affirmative action say that it is harmful to certain other groups because it elevates certain minority groups over other groups. But I think Ashley is able to unpack a little bit more of the nuance behind the discussion around this topic.
Yeah, so affirmative action, just like Anna, you said, is usually referring to that set of policies that are put in place in college admissions that positively support members of disadvantaged groups or underrepresented groups that have previously suffered discrimination in areas such as education, employment, and housing. So a lot of Asian parents I know will be like, affirmative action is bad because it means that my child who has like a better SAT score, better extracurriculars, better GPA will not get in over a student who comes from a different background, who might be Latinx or Black, and that student would get preferential treatment. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that we can really use affirmative action and be like, oh, it's bad because it's giving other minorities a chance to go to college, because I don't think that college is a merit-based process really at all. If you look towards college admissions and the Ivy Leagues, 77% of the white individuals going to these like top colleges are either legacy, like a family member of a faculty member, or recruited athletes. So if we're truly looking towards affirmative action, it's not hurting Asian Americans because other minority groups are being accepted in. It's hurting Asian Americans because white supremacy efforts are always going to be involved in that. And I think it's also important to note here that the movement against affirmative action, basically saying we want to get rid of that, those policies that are within college admissions, is led by a white man. It's not led by Asian Americans. This white man literally used hate against other minority groups for Asian Americans to rally around him. And he made this myth up that, affirmative action hurts Asians, when in fact it really only hurts white Americans who don't want their legacy recruited athlete and faculty member spots taken from them to give to those students who haven't had historically the same experiences and the same opportunities that these students have. If you have any opinions on this, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to have a discussion about them. So please chime in. We don't want it to just be like us talking at you. We'd rather have a discussion. Anyone? There's no wrong or right answer. We just want to hear opinions of y'all.
Well, I mean, I'm not super informed on like affirmative action and stuff, and what like you just said definitely has applied to me. Like my mom told me that she's kind of like not happy about how, because with all the Black Lives Matter stuff, all the colleges are going to try to be increasing their quotas of like their percentage of Black people getting accepted to like show that they're in support. And I don't really know if this is true or not, but she says that that's going to probably be taking Asian American spots, which with what you just said probably isn't true. So I can see how it impacts like our parents, because they're all in like the same little circle. They all just like talk to each other. Yeah.
Definitely. So I have definitely had this conversation with my parents before, like earlier. I don't think, from my knowledge, I don't think that colleges have racial quotas. I'm pretty sure affirmative action is just a set of policies that ensure that those who are underrepresented are represented within colleges. And I'm not sure that BLM would really have an impact on like colleges suddenly wanting to be diverse in some way. But I definitely see why Asian parents would be mad if they didn't understand the true reason why affirmative action is formed. I think it's also really important to just remember that like we're kind of always being used as a tool to push up white individuals and as a tool for white supremacy. You can see this when like literally we're always used by like, because of the model minority myth, we're constantly used as a way to silence other minority groups and silence the oppression of other minorities. Even within affirmative action, we're being used as a tool by white individuals who lead the movement against affirmative action to like silence and deny opportunity from other minority groups who definitely deserve those opportunities because they have been historically oppressed by America. So yeah, I think that these are definitely great concerns that our parents have. I just don't know how informed they are. And I definitely still have those conversations with my parents about affirmative action, whether or not I disagree with them. But I think that it's important to know the whole story, and whether or not you like agree or disagree with me on that, we always should be trying to seek out different opinions and trying to see what other people think.
Also, straight up, affirmative action benefits white women the most. Like, that is definitely true. And also, things like Ashley mentioned, things that aren't called affirmative action, but really kind of are, legacy, preferential treatment for recruiting for sports, like all those things are basically affirmative action, but they just don't call it the same name, and they're not as well known, or not as, there aren't really as many heated discussions around those topics, and that sort of preferential treatment flies under the radar. So I think it's important to question the way that we characterize affirmative action versus some other policies. Do we want to move on to POC solidarity?
Sure. You want to talk about it, or should I?
Yeah, I'll just introduce it briefly and once again want to open it up to discussion. So POC solidarity has really come into the limelight a lot, what with the BLM movements. But also it's a question of what is our role as Asian Americans in the social sphere, in advocating for these movements in support of more like awareness for issues affecting Black, Latinx, and Asian American communities. And why do you think it's important to stand in solidarity with our minority peers instead of allowing white supremacy to like tear us down?
Anyone can chime in. No answer is wrong. Maybe, do you guys understand what POC solidarity is, or should we like maybe? Okay, so the concept of POC solidarity, POC stands for people of color or person of color. Asian Americans fall under that, I guess, group. The only people who don't are white individuals. So POC solidarity means that we're standing in solidarity with other minority groups and other people of color. So even though we might not necessarily face the same oppression that Black Americans or Latinx Americans face, we still will stand in solidarity and will still support those movements that they're waging and those protests that they're having, because we acknowledge the fact that oppression against any minority within America is oppression against all minorities. Does that make sense, or should we go deeper into that statement? Okay, awesome. So the reason why oppression against one minority is always going to be oppression against every single minority within America is because the idea of I think race dynamics within America is not like there's white and then there's Asian and there's Latinx and there's Black and then there's Native American and indigenous populations. It's basically white and then minority populations as a whole, because white individuals often will propel themselves in a way to kind of put themselves at the top of the race hierarchy and use that as a way to only propel their own success. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, like white hate, like we should hate on all white people, like definitely not. I'm just saying that we need to acknowledge the systems of racism that have occurred and are still present within our society to make sure that we can combat those systems and ensure true equality in the future. So the reason why we say POC solidarity and the reason why we support POC solidarity is because it allows for us to acknowledge the suffering of other groups while simultaneously making sure that the suffering of our group is heard. And I think it's also very important to note that being aware of the suffering of, like, for example, Black Americans or Latinx Americans does not take away the suffering of you. It does not take the suffering of Asian Americans historically within America. And acknowledging that oppression does not mean that your oppression means anything less. It just means that you're acknowledging the fact that these systems that have hurt you in the past also hurt other groups and continue to hurt these groups and ourselves right now. That's the reason why I personally don't see why we should not be supporting POC solidarity, just because I think that acknowledging oppression in any case does not mean that you cannot acknowledge your own oppression or the oppression that you faced. So it really makes no sense to deny the oppression of others or not elevate the oppression that others have faced. Any thoughts here? Again, we really want to have a discussion, not just talking.
Well, I'd say that like I completely agree with what you said, because definitely minorities as a whole have experienced oppression in one way or another, and as like those who have experienced oppression, it's really important, especially like during these times, to stand in solidarity with other people of color being oppressed and recognize that there's systematic oppression still existed in the United States and that it's affecting our everyday lives. I do know like some of my friends' parents like that didn't like support the Black Lives Matter movement had the reasoning like, oh, when like the coronavirus and like epidemic was going on and there was increased xenophobia, like the people of color, like they didn't stand in solidarity with us. We were like the only ones that had to deal with it. So why should we stand in solidarity with like the Black Lives Matter movement. And I heard a lot of arguments like that, especially like around like my Asian community. But I completely like disagree because, you know, as a step towards recognizing the oppression and like trying to improve from that and trying to change from it, there needs to be a place where we stand together in solidarity and recognize it, and because we know what it's like to be oppressed, so we should stand in solidarity. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, how I really see it is like, I mean, I can't really say much because, I haven't lived up to, or like, I haven't lived up to what I want to be at in life, but I can say no matter what, like all this like myths and stuff, it shouldn't be a factor in how you look at yourself. Like just because you might be Asian and you're the minority doesn't mean you can't achieve this in life. Like no matter what, like, excludes Asian or whatever, all of this, like, I understand all of this, but the point is, like, we can all live our own lives, and we're lucky to just be alive and be able to live in America in the first place, and we should just, take this and, just live, like, we can't change any of this. Like, maybe we could change a little bit of it, but it's all about ourselves. And that's the same thing I see in BLM, too.
So you're saying each one for his own in a world of racism?
Yeah, pretty much. We can't really change much. Like we'll just live to what we can do. What we just like, do the stuff that we can control and we have the power to control.
Okay.
Like this stuff we can't really control.
I mean, I respect your opinion. I mean, we did want a discussion, so I appreciate you speaking out.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be going into ways that as a group we can combat the myth. But I see your point in that like it should be every man for themselves. But I also think that in a system of oppression, the only way that you can combat it is coming together and being aware of those systems and not denying them. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I just like noticed something. This is just like a comment, but I just like recently on the media, there's been like this fox eye trend, and I just think it's like really, yeah, it's just like really hypocritical that a lot of white people like make fun of Asian culture and our appearance, and yet they like use our features as like a trend. So I just thought that was like really interesting when I saw that going around on the media.
Yeah, definitely. Again, that's just another example of like cultural appropriation in which we're not accepted until white individuals think that we're attractive in some way or that we should be appreciated in some way. And we aren't accepted until white individuals say that we can't be.
Personally, I just wanted to mention something, and that is that since like maybe it's different, but like I live in Canada and a lot of my friends like live in Canada, right? So then we don't like really get hit as hard by like the cultural discrimination. So then like I think that coming here was a great idea because I know the US and Canada are probably a little bit different in that way. So then if I don't know like a lot about it in Canada, but we still learn about like cultural suppression in school, but we don't like face it like in real life. So I think that like learning about it outside of what we normally used to is like nice.
Awesome. We're going to go into ways that we can dismantle the myth and combat it in some way. If we want to move to the next slide, we've listed out 4 kind of bare reasons why and how you can dismantle that myth. First of all, educating yourselves and those around you about the historical context. I'm pretty sure most people don't know that the myth and the term model minority was used as a way of Black suppression and anti-Blackness from the very start. And I think acknowledging that fact and kind of educating individuals about both Asian American history and the history of the term model minority is a great way to get started to dismantle and combat that really pernicious myth. Anais, if you want to go on the next one.
Yeah, number 2, understand that the model minority myth is a tool of white supremacy. Asians did not choose to be characterized as the model minority. It is not something that we have rallied around or that we have chosen as an identity marker for ourselves. Rather, our goal is that through this presentation, after learning about the history of Asian Americanism, you can learn to understand the ways that because of a lot of historical events like the Cold War, the competition between communism and capitalism, it was convenient for the white majority to create the model minority in order to help them achieve their own goals.
Yeah. So for the third one, understanding that the collective is important while individual differences still exist. This refers to both within Asian American groups and I guess minority individuals as a whole within America. So Asian American identity is something really important. So coming together as a group is something really powerful because we can have that political identity. We can really rally around these issues together as a whole rather than just division. But at the same time, we also understand that individual differences do exist and individual differences in culture still needs to be kind of both, I guess, put at the top, but also like valued alongside other ones, if that makes sense. So understanding that while your individual culture might be important to you, the collective is still important, and the collective as a whole is still something that we should be valuing.
And then finally, number 4 is to demand representation. I find this really empowering because it is when Asian Americans we can tell our own stories using our own voices. So in compare, like this contrasts with the origins of the model minority myth, created by white people, tool of the white majority. However, when we demand representation, Asian Americans are able to characterize ourselves as what we want to be characterized. We're telling our own stories. We're standing in solidarity with people of color. And in this way, we can change the narrative and the way that we're represented in media and in pop culture. And I think that's just really powerful because we're basically seizing the means of how we present ourselves to the world and how we want to tell our stories.
On that point, do you guys have any like Asian American individuals within Hollywood or just like, I guess even Asian Canadian individuals that you guys think are good markers of representation that you would like to share?
Who are these people, y'all? Raise their hand if you know who they are.
Isn't that like the cast from Crazy Rich Asians or something?
Yes. Yeah, who watched that movie? Has anyone watched that movie? It was a good movie.
Wait, do you guys think that that movie kind of like also perpetuated the whole stereotype? Because like, and also like in addition, the people in that movie literally are so bad at Chinese, which I think was really
Okay.
not okay.
Fair.
I agree. Like it does perpetuate a stereotype about Chinese Americans and then also like Singaporean Americans. But at the same time, I feel like because it is just one movie that is showing the experience of like one individual, it's always going to perpetuate a stereotype of some kind, right? Because we have such a lack of representation within Hollywood and Western media as a whole. So the only way that we can actually like get accurate films out that don't perpetuate stereotypes is having more of those films out that represent more diverse backgrounds and the Asian American community as a whole rather than just one individual's experience. So yes, I definitely agree. It does perpetuate some pretty bad stereotypes. At the same time, we cannot combat those stereotypes and we cannot come up with a way to like not have stereotypes within Asian American representation in the West without actually having more representation.
I agree. This is something also, I don't know if you guys have heard of this show. It's called Never Have I Ever, and it's on Netflix. And it's a story about an Indian American. It's created by Mindy Kaling. But basically, Mindy Kaling is an Indian American. And when she was creating the show, she was also very aware of how she didn't want to perpetuate stereotypes. But something that you guys should be aware of is that we have so little representation that inevitably when media and films are put out, there's going to be criticism of how it doesn't live up to the standards of X person or Y person, because everyone, you have to understand, our experiences are not all the same. They cannot be represented and encompassed simply by one film. And so, because we lack so much representation, I mean, there is going to be some sort of pushback from the Asian American community saying, oh, this doesn't represent me. And I mean, how could it? This is only one film. There are millions of different Asian American experiences, but that's why we need to demand more representation. And that's why we want Asian Americans to come up and tell our own stories, because the Asian American experience is so multifaceted. It's not one dimensional, right?
Does anyone recognize any other people on the screen?
Hassan, Naj, from the, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of like the reason why we put these pictures up is not only to like celebrate Asian American representation, but at the same time demonstrate that there's so little Asian American representation that a lot of us know about these people simply because like that's all we have, right? On the other hand, white individuals, because we're living in America, because Hollywood and just like American society is so dominated by white culture and white power. We're constantly like seeing white faces. I honestly don't know that many white celebrities, but like I will know like most of the Asian American celebrities just because that's all the representation I have. So the fact that we have so little representation that most people can recognize these individuals just off the bat is also something kind of telling of the lack of representation within the United States.
Mm. Hey, Ashley, just really quickly, time check. Do you know how much time we have?
4 minutes. They're kind of dragging it out.
This is the last slide, right?
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of dragging it out for 4 minutes. Anyone recognize the third picture?
It's the music group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've never listened to them before, but I've heard of them.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of people I know who are also Asian American listen to 88 Rising, again, because that's basically like the little representation we have within American and Western media as a whole. So it's kind of something that we can cling on to as a way to represent ourselves while listening to music or absorbing pop culture.
Could I add something? I mean, you guys could disagree, but in my opinion on this is I don't think many Asians would want to, because majority of the Asians are highly educated. They go to like, big tech companies and work, earn like, many actually, a lot of people earn a 7-figure income. And I don't think they would really want to like be on one of these shows. And in the first place, pop culture is dominated by whites because I mean, it's just my opinion. I don't really think a lot of Asian Americans would want to do pop culture and this stuff in the first place, because first, their English isn't that good. And even if they were to make a movie in Chinese, not many people would know Chinese in the first place. And it would only be, Chinese people who would be watching it. Then you might as well just go to run a VPN and go to China and watch some Baidu movies,
I don't think we're talking about like Asian people, like Asian immigrants.
Yeah, you guys are talking about the representation of Asian Americans in pop culture.
Yeah, but like I speak English better than I speak Chinese. Like I don't.
Yeah, I'm talking about that's the new you guys are the generation, like the new generation, Generation Z. But in this generation, like not having like underrepresented, like how Asian Americans are underrepresented in pop culture is understandable, and it's probably and it should be happening, because in the first place, most of the people, like our parents, are all immigrants. Are immigrants going to be like, I don't know.
I think that's
this generation, we're going to have a lot of new people come into the pop culture.
I think that's a very big generalization. Like Asian Americans have been present in America since the 1880s, even before that. I don't think that just because there was like this huge horde of Asians coming in like the 1960s means that we deserve any less representation than other minority groups within America. I don't know. I personally disagree with those statements. You are beholden to your own opinion. I don't think that it's true that the large majority of Asian Americans are like earning 7 figures. I don't think that the large majority
6 figures. 6 figures. I meant 6 figures. 6 figures is still a
Well, I
big.
think what he's getting
Well,
at.
it's not like realistic. That's just a big generalization. It's kind of imposing the model minority myth that like all Asian American immigrants that come work so hard that they get to like 6-figure income, when that's not true. That's just a generalization. And
I have to disagree with this. That's kind of true. That's really true. Like a Asian wouldn't move to America to get less than like to earn like a 5-figure income. Like they're looking for America to build a family, get a good job, be able to send their kids to good colleges. They're not looking to be like the average person, because it's just the truth that that's not Asian minority. It's the truth that majority of the Asians who move to America are just hard workers. Like it's literally true.
well,
Or else you would move back to China.
I see your point on like how immigrants that come to America, they are like trying to achieve like the greater goal of like one day earning that 5-figure income. But you need to realize that like that's not like something that's really easy to do. And again, if like you want to achieve that, a part of it comes from like having like being like a specified major or something. But that's not all of the Asian Americans that are coming to America. That's a generalization, because yes, all of them may have a goal to one day get to that point, but it's not so easy to get to that point in a snap. And not all Asian Americans out there are like earning 5-figure incomes.
I agree. Asian Americans are actually the least likely group to be promoted to managerial positions. Even though we are like on average, Asian Americans as a demographic group, we earn more than some other minority groups. However, we are actually the lowest minority group in terms of the numbers that are being promoted to like leadership positions and managerial positions. And you might ask, why is that? It's because of everything that we talked about in this presentation, because there is a structure that does work against like minorities. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. In terms of representation, I mean, I think it's fair that sure, maybe not everybody wants to be a celebrity or to work in the entertainment industry, but that's not what the point of this presentation is about. The point of this presentation is to talk about why there's a lack of these sort of like role models that we look up to. It's because of structures that are currently in place that don't value Asian voices. And like the purpose of this presentation was certainly like not to impose a point of view on you, but we hope that it's encouraged you to, you know, just be more open-minded and at least to listen to another perspective. And
I
I
understand
that
it's
you might
because
have
you guys said there's 4 minutes left, and I wanted to share my opinion. It's not my opinion, but it's just what I've seen. But I'm just a kid and I haven't seen much, and neither have all of us. So we still have a lot to learn.
And we really value your opinion as well. So I'd like to have a longer or more deeper discussion if you want to later. I don't want to.
Yeah, that would actually be pretty good. Yeah.
Awesome. I don't want to hold up anyone else. So how about we end right now, and then maybe during office hours we can have maybe another discussion with everyone or whoever wants to come, and we can see if we want to talk then, so everyone can go to lunch now. But yeah, just wanted to reiterate, we respect your opinion. We value it. Really happy to see that everyone is like feeling brave enough and like, I guess, feeling comfortable enough to express their own opinions, even in like a very one-sided presentation.
Yeah, I agree.